Hello everyone and welcome to the paper and presentation workshop for Dr. Johnston's 440 class. So this semester you're going to be writing a paper and giving a presentation utilizing evidence-based research studies that you're going to find. The paper portion is a critique of a single research study, although you may use other additional research studies to support your opinion. While the presentation portion, you will use research studies to defend a position on a video that you'll watch in class. For both the paper and presentation projects, you'll need to find and use quantitative research studies, which have numerically measurable outcomes. Examples of quantitative research might be blood pressure, blood glucose, or body fat percentage. Qualitative research, on the other hand, is different from quantitative because qualitative studies look at outcomes that aren't able to be numerically measured. Some examples of qualitative research might include open-ended survey questions or conducting focus groups. Again, qualitative research data is not numerically measured, while quantitative research is. I stress this point because for the paper and presentation, only quantitative research studies should be used. A helpful way to tell if a research study is quantitative is to look for numbers, graphs, and charts. And there are a few different types of quantitative research out there. In cross-sectional studies, researchers are looking for a description of events. An example might be creating a survey to gain an understanding of household income in a certain population at a specific time, or epidemiological research that examines the patterns, causes, and effects of skin cancer in a particular group of people. Research that may be looking at a single point in time or over a long period, such as a cohort study. But it's important to know that this research is simply observational and there's no intervention that takes place. Again, in cross-sectional research, you're not manipulating a variable, you're just observing a phenomenon. On the other hand, in randomized clinical trials, you do have an intervention or manipulation of a variable to observe changes or differences in results. So in randomized clinical trials, you have at least two groups that are randomized into at least two levels of treatment, an active treatment or a placebo. In this type of research, it's important that the participants and the researchers are blind to the treatment, since we want to ensure that any results are due to the treatment and the treatment alone. Randomized clinical trials also minimize confounding variables, which are variables that may affect results other than the manipulation. These randomized clinical trials also provide objective measures of outcomes, which are great for analyzing results. So while cross-sectional studies are a description of events, a randomized clinical trial is an intervention, such as a manipulation of a variable to look for change. As previously discussed, qualitative research deals with feelings, themes, and other outcomes that are not numerically measured. A review pulls together different quantitative research studies and summarizes the current state of knowledge on that particular topic. A meta-analysis is similar in that it pulls together different articles on a particular topic and analyzes the results to see if a pattern exists. But it's a bit more in-depth than a review since it uses statistical analysis to look for trends. A systematic review summarizes the best available research on a specific question or topic. So these types of articles can be used with both the paper and presentation, but they cannot be the main article discussed to support your idea. The main article in your paper and presentation must be an experimental study. So going through all of this, you're probably wondering why research is so important and why the different types of research matter. And this quote puts it very nicely. Perhaps more than any other discipline, nutrition furnishes an unrelenting barrage of media news. Here's an example of two studies with different results relating to coffee consumption and heart health. In the cross-sectional study, researchers observe an association between coffee consumption and a reduced risk of cardiovascular disease and stroke. On the other hand, in the experimental trial, They found that coffee consumption increased hypertension and myocardial risk. So looking at these two studies, it's important to ask questions and think about which study is more controlled. Are there any other variables that could influence the results that we don't know about? Which of these studies control for these confounding variables? These are the same types of questions you should be asking yourself when finding articles for your projects. So here we have a pictorial representation of how a cross-sectional research study is performed. A small sample is taken from a population, and then the results from that small sample are used to make conclusions about the large population. What can be the problem with this generalization? What if this small population doesn't accurately depict the large population? These limitations are things that need to be discussed if you choose to use a cross-sectional study as part of your projects for this class. Here we have a pictorial representation of an experimental study. What makes an experimental study is the random assignment of participants to at least 2 different groups or treatments. It's really important to understand what random assignment is and why it's important. Basically, if participants are specifically selected for a particular group, this is not random assignment. This is an important point to consider for your paper because if participants aren't randomly assigned, then it can be difficult to conclude that any results are attributed to the treatment and the treatment alone, regardless of individual similarities or differences. If random assignment isn't available, some experimenters will instead use matching. Matching involves finding 2 participants with similar characteristics such as age, sex, and weight, then placing one in the experimental group and placing the other in the control group. Again, this helps to control differences between the 2 groups so experimenters can be confident that any results they find are attributed to the experiment alone. If you'll notice down here at the bottom, there's information from a meta-analysis that performed statistical analysis to compare results from 11 randomized clinical trials. And they found that drinking 5 cups of coffee per day significantly increased participant blood pressure. So it's important to think about what is the best way to test the relationships between coffee and cardiovascular health. Could it be a cross-sectional study, an experimental study, or even a meta-analysis? It's also important to understand that because a cross-sectional study isn't manipulating a variable while holding other variables constant, it cannot prove a theory. We're just observing here. It can be easy to write in your paper or talk about in your presentation that one thing caused another to happen, but be careful with this. Only in an experiment where the author explains a clear cause and effect relationship can the word cause be used. This is less common than you may think, so you might instead explain relationships using the words associated with, correlate with, contributed to, things like that. So for the paper, each student will write 1 3-page research paper critique independently of others. So this is an individual assignment. Each student is to select a quantitative research study on a micronutrient from a preceding lecture. We've already covered what a quantitative research study is in previous slides, and just make sure the article that you select is from the past 5 years. Exceptions can be made to this if you find an article that you just love that's older than 5 years, but just make sure you either email it or bring it to either Dr. Johnston or I, Lauren, your TA, in advance for approval. So reviews, meta-analyses, and qualitative studies should not be used for this paper. We've talked about that throughout this lecture, but feel free to ask Dr. Johnston or I if you're unsure. We'd rather have you off to the right start using the right type of article. This paper should include an introduction paragraph, a discussion about the purpose of this study, and the hypothesis. You'll need to discuss which research design was used and why, as well as the validity of the research methods that were used. If in your opinion the author didn't use the appropriate research design, it's okay to say that. It's just important that you justify this argument and support your opinion. Next, you'll need to discuss the results with actual data from your paper, and then why this data is useful to the public. You should be able to explain what information we're gaining from this study and why it's important. Then, now that we have this new information, where can this research go? For instance, if the study was done on an adult population, maybe future research could observe the same study with children. Things like that to gain further future knowledge. Finally, your conclusion should tie together the different concepts, ideas, and possibilities that you've discussed. Your paper should have at least 9 references from research literature. I'll be posting a separate video with instructions on how to use the ASU Library website and search for articles in PubMed. It's really important that you don't use any quotes in this paper. Quotes are rarely used in scientific writing, so get used to finding alternative ways to explaining and integrating thoughts from the research that you've found. For this paper, do not write in the first person and make sure that your paper is typed to meet 3 full pages exactly. If the paper you're critiquing can't be accessed through PubMed, you need to make sure that you provide a copy of the article to Dr. Johnston or I. We just want to make sure that we have access to the article, and if we're grading your submission and we can't find it through PubMed, that makes it very difficult. Make sure you submit your paper to SafeAssign and Blackboard by the due date to receive credit. Papers that aren't submitted through SafeAssign won't be graded. Dr. Johnson has provided you with a grading rubric for this paper, which is an incredibly helpful way to make sure you've met all the requirements. Grade yourself with this rubric and even have a friend or a family member read through your paper and give you a grade based off this rubric. I highly encourage you to utilize the Writing Center. There are individuals there eagerly waiting to read your work, compare it to the rubric, and provide helpful feedback that may really benefit your grade. It's definitely worth your time. Another way to gain helpful guidance and feedback is a peer review by one of your classmates. This peer review is due 2 weeks before the due date. We expect that every paper that's returned to us has comments on the science, flow, logic, and grammar. We don't want to see peer reviews that have only critiqued and provided feedback regarding grammar alone. It's just not helpful and defeats the purpose of a peer review. No paper's perfect, so there's always something to comment on, and your thoroughness is really appreciated. So as I mentioned, you'll turn your papers into me 2 weeks before the due date. I will de-identify all the papers that I received so the author's name is not listed. Then I'll distribute them randomly throughout the class. You'll be grading these papers from a peer perspective, so make sure that you do a thorough job and provide lots of comments about the paper science, flow, and logic, not just the grammar. This critique is worth 10 points, so make sure you provide thoughtful comments. Again, these papers will be de-identified, so no one will know whose paper they're reviewing. So just to give you a better idea of due dates, here's a visual of the tentative class schedule. Notice here that the class will be split into one of 3 due date sections, each with a different due date for their paper and presentation. On this schedule, you can see that the research paper peer critiques will be due 2 weeks before the actual due date of the final paper. This allows enough time to turn your paper into me, your TA, have it reviewed by a peer, then have the paper returned to you with feedback with plenty of time to make changes before submitting your final project. So here is the research paper rubric previously mentioned. It's a good idea to be familiar with this before starting your paper and to refer to it throughout writing your paper. This is the same rubric that should be used when critiquing a peer's paper. So in-text citations should use a numbering system in your paper, such as the American Medical Association or the Academy for Nutrition and Dietetics. Websites can be cited, but won't be counted as one of the required number of references. Another posted video will explain how to create these in-text citations and bibliographies in the appropriate style for this paper, so make sure to look for that on Blackboard. So on to your group presentations. This class will be split into 9 groups of 4 to 5 students. You can look on Blackboard to see which group you've been assigned to, and then check the syllabus or the tentative schedule to see your due dates. This assignment will be worth 50 points per student. So the group presentation is to be about 20 minutes long or 15 slides, which is about 3 slides per student. Notice that an introduction slide or a reference slide at the end may be included, but these slides are not to be counted as one of the 3 slides per student. As a group, you'll need to discuss strategies for critiquing the information presented in a video you'll see in class. You're going to support and discuss your thoughts with science to make up your presentation. So each group will identify a topic. Maybe it's an issue, an argument, a myth, or a fun fact for their assigned nutrient. The presentation should be developed around this determined topic using scientific literature to support your thoughts as a group. Do not use any information presented in class to any extent. Your presentation information should be up to date and should flow together as a group. So it's really important to meet with your group and make sure that you're on the same page for this presentation. Each group will present on at least 2 quantitative research studies related to their topic. Just like the paper assignment, this group presentation should have an introduction, a body, and a conclusion around the topic. There are 2 surveys that are required to be taken by you. One is completed 1 week before your presentation, and the other is completed the day after your presentation. These surveys are date sensitive, so make sure to make a note in your planner once you know the date of your group's presentations. These surveys give us a chance to understand how the group has worked together as a whole, and this should help everyone to stay accountable to working hard as a team in preparation for your presentation. This part is really important. Slides for your presentation need to be sent to the TA, which is me, Lauren, by 5 p.m. the day before your presentation. This is really important because as the TA, I will have all the slides prepared and ready on presentation day, avoiding individual group confusion and technical difficulties. So looking on the syllabus when you see your day for presentation, I would just mark the day before at 5 p.m. in your planner and say presentation is due. Just so you have that in your mind, knowing that 5 p.m. the day before presentation day is when you need to have your presentation turned in. Also, make sure that each slide has the name of the person who's presenting it on the lower right-hand side of the slide. So bottom right-hand side, that will help us to keep track of who's presenting and make sure we're grading the right person as the presentation is going on. It's important that the presentation flows well between students since this is a group assignment. This means meeting often and starting early on this assignment. Each student will have 4 to 5 minutes to present their part, so make sure you practice with a timer as a group. Since the presentations are timed, we'll stop you if your group goes over the allotted time. If this happens, the parts your presentation didn't get to won't be graded, so practice is really important. Again, at least 2 quantitative research articles must be incorporated and discussed in your presentation. Make sure slides discussing these articles are cited and that they appear on a reference slide at the end of your presentation. Again, each group member is responsible for their 3 slides only, but the presentation must flow as a group. Lastly, a grading rubric, which is on the next slide, is the rubric that will be used to grade your presentation and individual member contributions. So this rubric is a really good guide for developing your presentation as you go along. So here's that rubric. As you go through this, if you have any questions at all, please stop by my office hours or send an email to Dr. Johnston or I, Lauren, your TA, and we'll be more than happy to help. Thank you so much for watching this video and good luck with these projects.